The blood on Penelope Reed's hands wouldn't wash away no matter how hard she scrubbed, though it wasn't her own blood, and the stain existed only in her mind as she sat in the corner of the seamstress shop in Silver Reef, Utah, her needle moving through fabric with the same steady precision it had maintained for the past 3 years. The autumn of 1878 had arrived with crisp mornings and golden afternoons, but Penelope barely noticed the changing seasons anymore. Her world reduced to the small room where she stitched wedding dresses for other women and mended work shirts for miners who tracked silver dust through the streets. Mrs. Henderson, who owned the shop, often complained that Penelope was too quiet, that she frightened away customers with her silence. But the truth was that Penelope had simply run out of words the day her father died in a mining accident back in Nevada, and her mother followed 6 months later from grief that consumed her like a slow, burning fire. Silver Reef was a strange town, built on an impossibility that geologists had sworn could never exist: silver in sandstone. Yet here it stood, defying logic, much like Penelope herself, who had survived when she should have crumbled. The shop sat on Main Street, wedged between the Wells Fargo office and a saloon that grew louder as each day progressed into evening. Penelope kept her head down, her dark blonde hair always pinned severely back, her green eyes focused on her work. She was 22 years old and felt ancient, as though she had lived several lifetimes already. "That mountain man is in town again," Mrs. Henderson said, peering through the window with poorly disguised interest. "Ryder Zimmerman. Comes down from the hills every few months for supplies. Trades furs and keeps to himself mostly. My husband says he's got a cabin up past the sandstone cliffs, lives alone up there like some kind of wild creature." Penelope didn't look up from the hem she was sewing, though she had seen the man in question before. It was impossible not to notice him when he rode into town on his massive bay horse, his broad shoulders blocking out the sun, his dark hair hanging past his collar, his face weathered and scarred from a life spent in harsh elements. He looked like he had been carved from the same red rock that surrounded their town, all hard angles and rough edges, his hands large enough to snap a man's neck, but surprisingly gentle when he handled his horse's reins. "They say he came out here after the war," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice dropping to a gossipy whisper despite the empty shop. "Saw too much death and couldn't stand being around people anymore. Can't say I blame him, though it seems a lonely existence." Penelope understood loneliness better than most. She lived in a boarding house 2 streets over, in a room barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand. And she spoke perhaps 20 words a day, most of them yes and thank you, and that will be $2. The other women in town had stopped trying to befriend her after the first year, put off by her silences and the way she seemed to look through people rather than at them. They called her strange, odd, too quiet by half. Penelope didn't mind. She had learned that silence was safer than speech, that keeping your thoughts locked away meant they couldn't be used against you. The shop door opened, the bell chiming with false cheerfulness, and Penelope felt the air change in the room. She glanced up out of habit and found herself looking directly at Ryder Zimmerman, who had ducked his head to fit his considerable height through the doorway. He was even larger up close, his chest and arms thick with muscle earned from splitting wood and hauling game and surviving in wilderness that would kill softer men. His eyes were a startling blue, like high mountain sky, and they swept the shop with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to cataloging threats. Mrs. Henderson immediately smoothed her skirts and produced her brightest smile. "Mr. Zimmerman, what a pleasant surprise." "What can we do for you today? Need a coat mended?" he said, his voice deep and rough from disuse like gravel rolling down a mountainside. "Tore it on some rocks. Of course, of course. Penelope here is our finest seamstress. She'll have it fixed in no time, Mrs. Henderson beckoned Penelope forward with an impatient gesture. Penelope set down her current project and stood, acutely aware of how small she was compared to this man who seemed to fill the entire shop with his presence. She held out her hand for the coat without speaking, her eyes fixed somewhere around his chest rather than his face. The coat was made of thick leather and fur, well crafted but showing signs of hard use. A long tear ran along one shoulder, seam where it had clearly caught on something sharp. "How long?" Ryder asked, directing the question at her rather than Mrs. Henderson. Penelope examined the damage carefully, running her fingers along the torn edges. The leather was good quality, would hold strong stitches. 3 days, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That all you got to say?" he asked, but there was no mockery in his tone, only curiosity. She looked up at him then, startled by the question, and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not irritation, not amusement. Something else. Something that made her heartbeat quicken inexplicably. "I can have it done in 2 if you need it sooner," she offered. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. 3 is fine. I got another coat." He reached into his pocket and pulled out several coins. "This enough?" "More than enough," Mrs. Henderson interjected, snatching the money before Penelope could respond. "We'll have it ready for you." Ryder nodded slowly, his gaze still on Penelope. "Appreciate it." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "What's your name?" "Penelope Reed," she said, surprised by the question. "Ryder Zimmerman," he said, though everyone already knew who he was. "See you in 3 days, Penelope Reed." After he left, Mrs. Henderson counted the coins with satisfaction. "Overpaid by half. Mountain men don't know the value of money, I suppose. Well, don't just stand there, girl. Get to work on that coat. A paying customer is a paying customer." Penelope took the coat to her workspace and spread it carefully across her table. It smelled of wood smoke and pine and something wild, like wind across open spaces. As she threaded her needle and began the careful work of repairing the tear, she found herself thinking about those blue eyes and the way he had asked her name, as though it mattered, as though she mattered. It was a dangerous thought, the kind that could lead to hope, and hope was something Penelope had learned to live without. The 3 days passed in their usual routine. Penelope arrived at the shop each morning at 7, worked until 6 in the evening, returned to her boarding house for a silent supper, and slept dreamlessly in her narrow bed. She finished Ryder's coat on the 2nd day, taking extra care with her stitches, making them small and even and strong enough to last through many more seasons in the mountains. She ran her hands over the repaired seam, checking for any irregularities, and found herself wondering what it would be like to live up in those hills, away from the noise of the town, surrounded by nothing but trees and sky and silence. On the 3rd day, Ryder came to collect his coat just before closing time. Penelope was alone in the shop. Mrs. Henderson had left early to attend to some domestic crisis involving her daughter. The bell chimed, and Penelope looked up from the dress she was hemming to find Ryder ducking through the doorway once again. He looked like he had bathed recently, his hair still slightly damp, his face freshly shaved. The effect was startling. Without the heavy beard, she could see the strong line of his jaw, the small scar that cut through his upper lip, the way his features were almost handsome despite their roughness. "Evening," he said, removing his hat. "Come for my coat." "Of course." Penelope stood and retrieved the coat from where she had hung it carefully on a peg. She brought it to him, holding it so he could see the repair. "I reinforced the seam all the way down. It should hold now. He examined her work with surprising attention to detail, running his calloused fingers over the stitches. "Fine work," he said approvingly. "Real fine work." He shrugged into the coat, testing the movement of his shoulders. The fit was perfect, the repair invisible unless you knew where to look. "Better than when I bought it new." "Thank you," Penelope said, unable to suppress a small flush of pride at the compliment. Ryder studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "You really are quiet, aren't you?" They weren't exaggerating. Penelope tensed, waiting for the criticism that usually followed such observations. Instead, Ryder smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his stern features. "I like it," he said simply. "Peaceful. Most folks talk just to hear themselves making noise. You only speak when you got something worth saying." The words struck something deep in Penelope's chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in so long she had almost forgotten what it was called. Recognition. Understanding. The sense of being seen not as deficient but as different, and different being acceptable. "Most people find it off-putting," she admitted. "Most people are fools," Ryder said bluntly. He shifted his weight, suddenly looking uncertain, this massive man who faced down bears and winter storms without flinching. "I was wondering. That is, I thought maybe. Would you take a walk with me? Just around town. Sun's still up for another hour." Penelope's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat into the safety of solitude. But something in his expression stopped her, a vulnerability that matched her own hidden fears. "All right," she heard herself say. They walked side by side through the streets of Silver Reef, as the autumn evening painted everything in shades of amber and gold. Ryder didn't push her to talk, didn't fill the silence with meaningless chatter. They simply walked, and gradually Penelope felt something inside her begin to unwind, a tension she had been carrying for so long it had become part of her structure. When they passed the saloon, several men called out greetings to Ryder, surprise evident in their voices at seeing him with company. He nodded acknowledgement but didn't stop. "You come to town often?" Penelope asked as they turned down a quieter side street. "Every few months when I need supplies. Coffee, flour, ammunition, things I can't make or hunt myself." He glanced at her. "Gets lonely up there sometimes, but it's better than being around people who expect things from you." "What kind of things?" Conversation, smiling, pretending you're fine when you're not. His voice held a bitterness that Penelope recognized. "After the war, everyone wanted me to just go back to being who I was before, but that person died at Antietam. They couldn't understand that." "I'm sorry," Penelope said softly. "You lose someone?" Ryder asked, his perceptiveness surprising her. "Both my parents, 2 years apart." The words came easier than she expected. "Everyone said I should move on, find a husband, start a family, as if grief worked on some kind of schedule." Ryder nodded slowly. "People don't like it when you won't heal the way they think you should." They had reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open desert and the sandstone cliffs rose in the distance, turned blood red by the setting sun. "You ever think about leaving, going somewhere else?" "Where would I go?" Penelope asked. "This is as good a place as any for someone who wants to be left alone." "Fair point." Ryder watched the sun sink lower, his profile sharp against the sky. "My cabin is about 5 miles up past those cliffs. There's a valley there, hidden away where I built my place. Got a creek running through it, pine trees all around. Most beautiful spot I've ever seen. Quiet too, real quiet." "It sounds lovely," Penelope said and meant it. Ryder turned to face her fully. "I meant what I said before. I like your quiet. It's not awkward or uncomfortable. It's just peaceful, like being in the mountains." He hesitated, then continued. "I don't come to town much and I don't know many people here, but I'd like to know you better if you'd be willing." Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs. Part of her wanted to run, to protect herself from the possibility of caring and losing again. But a larger part, a part she had thought dead, wanted to say yes, wanted to see where this unexpected connection might lead. "I'd like that too," she whispered. They arranged to meet the following Sunday, Ryder's next planned trip to town. As Penelope walked back to her boarding house that night, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It took her several moments to identify it. Anticipation. She was looking forward to something for the first time in years. The days until Sunday crawled by with excruciating slowness. Penelope found herself distracted at work, her mind wandering to thoughts of blue eyes and strong hands and a voice like distant thunder. Mrs. Henderson noticed her unusual preoccupation and made several pointed comments about young women who got ideas above their station, but Penelope barely heard her. She had spent so long feeling nothing that this sudden rush of emotion was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze that smelled of coming winter. Penelope dressed in her best day dress, a simple green cotton that she had made herself, and pinned her hair up with more care than usual. She met Ryder at the appointed time near the general store, and his face lit up when he saw her in a way that made her stomach flutter. "You look real pretty," he said with the directness she was coming to appreciate. "Thank you. You look nice as well." It was true. He had made an effort, wearing a clean shirt under his repaired coat, his hair tied back with a leather cord. They walked to a small restaurant that served decent food, and over roasted chicken and potatoes, they talked more than Penelope had talked in months. Ryder told her about his life in the mountains, the routines that structured his days, the animals he encountered, the changing seasons. He had a way of describing things that brought them to life. The sound of elk bugling in autumn, the absolute silence after a heavy snow, the way sunrise looked from his cabin door. In turn, Penelope found herself sharing memories of her childhood, stories about her parents she hadn't spoken aloud since their deaths. Ryder listened with complete attention, never interrupting, never offering platitudes. "You ever think about doing something other than sewing?" he asked as they shared a slice of apple pie for dessert. "Sometimes," Penelope admitted, "but I'm good at it and it keeps me fed and housed. That's more than many people have." "True enough." Ryder pushed a piece of pie around his plate thoughtfully. "But there's a difference between surviving and living." The word struck deep. "I suppose I've been surviving for a while now," Penelope said quietly. "Me too." Ryder's blue eyes met hers with understanding. "Maybe we could try the other thing, together." It was too soon, too fast, too unlikely. A mountain man and a seamstress who barely spoke. Yet somehow it felt right in a way that defied logic. "Maybe we could," Penelope agreed. Over the following weeks, Ryder began coming to town more frequently, finding excuses to make the trip down from his cabin. He always stopped at the seamstress shop, sometimes with actual items needing repair, sometimes just to see Penelope. Mrs. Henderson disapproved vocally, warning Penelope about the dangers of consorting with wild men who lived outside civilization, but Penelope paid her no mind. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt alive, felt connected to another human being in a way that brought joy rather than pain. Ryder was unfailingly gentle with her, careful not to push too hard or move too fast. They took walks through town, shared meals, and talked about everything and nothing. He never pressured her to be more talkative than she was comfortable being, and she came to treasure the comfortable silences that stretched between them. With Ryder, quiet wasn't a failing. It was a language they both spoke fluently. One crisp November afternoon, 6 weeks after their first walk together, Ryder arrived at the shop with a proposition. "Come up to my cabin," he said without preamble. "Just for the day, I want to show you my valley." Penelope hesitated. Such a trip would certainly damage her reputation, being alone with a man so far from town. But then again, her reputation was hardly sterling to begin with. The too quiet seamstress who kept to herself and had no friends. What did she have to lose? "All right," she said. They left early the next Sunday morning, Ryder's horse strong enough to carry them both. Penelope sat in front of him, acutely aware of his solid presence behind her, his arms on either side as he held the reins. The ride took over an hour, climbing steadily into the hills past the sandstone cliffs. The landscape changed as they ascended, the red desert giving way to pine forests and rocky outcroppings. The air grew cooler, scented with evergreen and clean earth. When they finally emerged into Ryder's Valley, Penelope caught her breath. He hadn't exaggerated. It was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. A meadow stretched before them, surrounded by tall pines, with a clear creek cutting through the center. At the far end stood a cabin, solidly built from logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Mountains rose behind it, their peaks already dusted with snow. "Ryder," she breathed. "It's magnificent." He helped her down from the horse, his hands spanning her waist easily. "Built the cabin myself 3 years ago. Took me most of a summer, but I wanted it done right." There was pride in his voice, justified pride. The cabin was beautiful work, each log carefully fitted, the roof tight and strong. He showed her around his homestead, pointing out the smokehouse where he preserved meat, the root cellar dug into the hillside, the small barn for his horse, and the mule he used for hauling supplies. Inside the cabin, Penelope found herself in a single large room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the furniture, though simple, was well made and comfortable. Everything was surprisingly neat for a bachelor, the floor swept clean, dishes washed and put away. "You keep a nice home," Penelope said, running her hand along the smooth wood of his table. "Not much else to do on winter nights but keep things orderly," Ryder said, looking pleased by the compliment. He busied himself building up the fire and putting on coffee. "Sit. Make yourself comfortable." Penelope settled into a chair near the fireplace, watching as Ryder moved around the space with easy familiarity. The domesticity of the moment filled her with unexpected longing. This could be her life, she thought. This peace, this quiet, this connection with a man who understood her. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it felt like coming home after a long journey. They spent the afternoon talking and drinking coffee. Ryder showed her his collection of books, an impressive library for a man who supposedly lived as a hermit. "He read constantly through the long winters," he explained, "everything from philosophy to poetry to agricultural manuals." Penelope confessed that she missed reading, that she had sold most of her books when she needed money after her mother died. Without a word, Ryder pressed 3 volumes into her hands, insisting she take them. As the afternoon light began to fade, Ryder prepared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread. They ate together at his table, and Penelope couldn't remember the last time she had felt so content. Everything about this felt right, the warmth of the fire, the taste of the food, the quiet companionship. When Ryder reached across the table and took her hand, she didn't pull away. "Penelope," he said, his rough voice gentler than she had ever heard it, "I know we haven't known each other long. And I know I'm not much of a catch, living up here away from everything. But I feel something with you that I never thought I'd feel again. Peace. Joy. Like maybe I could be more than just a man hiding from his ghosts." Penelope's eyes burned with unshed tears. "You make me feel alive again," she whispered. "I didn't think that was possible." Ryder stood and came around the table, pulling her gently to her feet. He cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, ever respectful of her boundaries. "Yes," she breathed, and then his lips were on hers, warm and soft despite his rugged exterior. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, as though he was afraid she might break. Penelope leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his broad chest, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt, the steady thump of his heart. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "Stay," Ryder said urgently. "Not just tonight. Stay here with me. Marry me, Penelope. Be my wife." It was madness. They had known each other less than 2 months, but Penelope had learned that life was short and uncertain, that happiness was rare and precious and not to be turned away when it appeared. "Yes," she said, the word coming easily, naturally. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across Ryder's face was like sunrise, transforming him completely. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, and Penelope found herself laughing too, the sound foreign but wonderful. When he set her down, he kissed her again, deeper this time, with a passion that set her blood singing. They made the trip back to Silver Reef in the dark, Ryder's arms steady around Penelope as they rowed. Her mind was spinning with the enormity of what she had agreed to, but underneath the shock was a current of certainty. This was right. This was meant to be. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Penelope gave her notice to Mrs. Henderson, who alternated between disapproval and grudging acceptance. The other women in town were scandalized that quiet Penelope Reed had caught the attention of the mysterious mountain man, but Penelope didn't care about their opinions. She sold most of her meager possessions, keeping only her clothes and a few precious personal items. Ryder came to town more frequently to help with preparations, and Penelope began to see how the townspeople reacted to him. They were wary but respectful, recognizing in him a man who could be dangerous if crossed, but was fundamentally decent. They were married on a cold December morning in 1878 by the circuit preacher who passed through Silver Reef once a month. The ceremony was simple, attended only by a handful of people, including the preacher's wife as witness. Penelope wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored wool, and Ryder wore his best shirt and a new leather vest. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ryder kissed her with a tenderness that made her forget they had an audience. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, Ryder having paid for the room in advance. He was patient and gentle, taking his time to ensure Penelope's comfort, his touch reverent as he helped her out of her wedding dress. Their joining was sweet and slow, Ryder murmuring words of love and reassurance as he introduced her to physical intimacy. Penelope had been nervous, uncertain, but Ryder's care and obvious devotion eased her fears. By the time they fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, Penelope felt transformed, no longer a silent ghost moving through life but a woman fully present in her own story. The next morning, they loaded Penelope's belongings onto Ryder's pack mule and made the journey up to the valley that would now be her home. As they rode through the trees and emerged into the meadow, Penelope felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged. The first weeks of marriage were an adjustment. Penelope had lived alone for so long that sharing space with another person felt strange at first. But Ryder was an easy companion, comfortable with silence, content to let her find her own rhythms within their life together. She took over the cooking and found she enjoyed creating meals in his well-stocked kitchen. She cleaned and organized, putting her own touches on the cabin. Ryder built her a sewing area near the window where the light was best, and Penelope spent her afternoons working on projects of her own choosing rather than endless mending for demanding customers. Winter settled over the valley in earnest, bringing heavy snows that sometimes kept them isolated for days at a time. Penelope discovered she loved the snow, the way it muffled all sound and created a cocoon of white silence around their cabin. On those long winter evenings, she and Ryder would sit by the fire, reading or talking quietly or simply existing in comfortable proximity. Sometimes, Ryder would play his harmonica, simple melodies that echoed beautifully in the stillness. They made love frequently, their physical connection deepening as they learned each other's bodies and preferences. Ryder was always attentive to her pleasure, his touch becoming more confident as Penelope grew bolder in expressing her desires. There was something profoundly healing in the intimacy they shared, as though they were both finding wholeness in each other's arms. One snowy January evening, as they lay tangled together beneath heavy quilts, Ryder traced patterns on Penelope's bare shoulder. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. Penelope turned to face him, studying his features in the firelight. His hair was loose around his shoulders, his blue eyes soft with contentment. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she said truthfully. "Are you?" "More than I deserve," Ryder said, pulling her closer. "You brought peace to my heart, Penelope. I didn't even realize how much noise was in my head until you came along and made it quiet." "That's what they always criticized me for," Penelope murmured, "being too quiet." "They were fools," Ryder said firmly. "Your quiet is a gift. It's like standing in a forest after fresh snow. Everything is calm and clear and beautiful." He kissed her forehead. "I love you, Penelope Zimmerman." Hearing her new name still sent a thrill through her. "I love you too, Ryder." As winter gave way to spring, Penelope settled more fully into her new life. She helped Ryder with the spring planting, learning to work the soil and plant seeds for the vegetables they would harvest in summer. She learned to identify edible plants in the forest, to preserve food, to manage the household so they could be as self-sufficient as possible. Ryder was a patient teacher, never making her feel inadequate when she struggled with unfamiliar tasks. In April, Penelope began to suspect she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses had always been irregular, so at first she wasn't certain. But as the weeks passed, and other symptoms appeared, tender breasts, morning nausea, unusual fatigue, she became increasingly sure. She waited until she was certain before telling Ryder, wanting to be absolutely positive. On a warm May evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Penelope took Ryder's hand and placed it on her still flat belly. "I'm carrying your child," she said simply. Ryder went absolutely still, his eyes wide with shock. Then his face crumpled and tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. "A baby," he whispered. "We're going to have a baby in late autumn, I think. October or November." Penelope found herself crying too, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Joy, she thought. These were tears of joy. Ryder pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. His whole body shook with emotion. "I never thought," he managed. "After everything I saw, everything I did in the war, I didn't think I deserved this kind of happiness." "You deserve every good thing," Penelope said fiercely, pulling back to look at him. "You're a good man, Ryder Zimmerman, the best man I've ever known." From that moment on, Ryder treated Penelope like she was made of spun glass. He insisted she rest more, do less physical work. He hovered anxiously whenever she showed the slightest sign of discomfort. Penelope found his protectiveness endearing if occasionally excessive. She had to gently remind him that pregnancy was not an illness, that women had been having babies since the dawn of time, that she was stronger than she looked. As summer progressed, and Penelope's belly began to swell with their growing child. She found a contentment she had never imagined possible. Her life in Silver Reef seemed like a dream from another lifetime. Here in this valley with this man who loved her completely, she was finally, fully herself. She no longer felt the need to hide or diminish herself. Ryder celebrated every part of her, including her quiet nature. They made one trip to Silver Reef in July, so Penelope could purchase fabric and supplies she would need for the baby. The journey was harder now with her changing body, but Ryder took it slow and careful, stopping frequently to let her rest. In town, the women who had once whispered about her odd behavior now clucked over her pregnancy, offering advice she didn't want and predictions about the baby's sex. Mrs. Henderson made pointed comments about how Penelope had gotten herself in a family way quickly, but Penelope ignored her. Let them gossip. It didn't touch her happiness. Back at the cabin, Penelope spent her afternoons sewing tiny clothes and blankets for the baby. Ryder built a beautiful cradle from pine, sanding it until the wood was smooth as silk, carving delicate designs into the headboard. Watching his large hands work with such precision and care, creating something beautiful for their child, filled Penelope with overwhelming love. In August, Ryder rode to Silver Reef alone and returned with a midwife named Mrs. Eleanor Turner, a capable woman in her 50s who had delivered half the babies in the territory. She agreed to come stay with them for the last month of Penelope's pregnancy and for a few weeks after the birth. Penelope was grateful for another woman's presence, especially one as knowledgeable and calm as Mrs. Turner. The baby came on a cold November night, arriving 3 weeks earlier than expected. Penelope's labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Ryder paced anxiously outside the cabin, chopping enough firewood to last a month, unable to sit still while his wife labored. Mrs. Turner remained calm and encouraging throughout, coaching Penelope through each contraction, checking her progress regularly. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, Penelope gave one final push and their child slid into Mrs. Turner's waiting hands. "A boy," the midwife announced triumphantly. A healthy baby boy, the infant's cry filled the cabin, strong and lusty. Mrs. Turner cleaned him quickly and laid him on Penelope's chest. Penelope looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face of her son and felt her heart expand impossibly large. He had Ryder's blue eyes and a shocking amount of dark hair. He was perfect. "Can I come in?" Ryder called from outside, his voice tight with anxiety. "Come meet your son," Mrs. Turner called back. Ryder burst through the door, his eyes immediately finding Penelope and the baby. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside the bed, staring at his son with an expression of absolute wonder. "He's so small," Ryder whispered, reaching out one finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. The infant immediately wrapped his fingers around Ryder's much larger one, and Ryder made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "He's strong," Penelope said softly. "Feel how tightly he grips." "What should we name him?" Ryder asked, unable to take his eyes off his son. They had discussed names but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at this tiny person who was part of both of them, Penelope knew exactly what to call him. "Robert," she said, "after my father, Robert Zimmerman." Ryder looked up at her, his eyes bright with tears. "Robert. That's perfect." Mrs. Turner stayed for 3 weeks, teaching Penelope how to nurse the baby, how to care for his umbilical cord, how to swaddle him properly. Ryder was a devoted father from the start, holding Robert for hours, talking to him in a gentle voice, marveling at every tiny movement and sound. Watching her strong, rugged husband cradle their delicate infant son was almost more than Penelope's heart could hold. The winter after Robert's birth was challenging. The baby didn't sleep well, often waking every few hours through the night. Penelope was exhausted, her body still recovering from childbirth while trying to meet the constant demands of a newborn. Ryder helped as much as he could, rocking Robert when he fussed, changing his cloths, bringing Penelope meals in bed when she was too tired to rise. They moved through those months in a haze of sleeplessness, but underneath, the exhaustion was profound joy. By the time spring arrived and Robert was 6 months old, life had settled into a new rhythm. The baby was sleeping longer stretches at night, smiling and laughing during the day. He was fascinated by everything, his blue eyes tracking movement, his hands reaching for objects within his grasp. Ryder built him a wooden rattle and a set of blocks, already planning the toys and tools he would make for his son as he grew. One warm April afternoon, Penelope was sitting on the porch with Robert in her lap when Ryder rode up from checking his trap lines. He dismounted and bounded up the steps, his face alight with excitement. "I've been thinking," he said, kneeling in front of her. "We should expand the cabin, add another room or two. Robert's going to need his own space as he gets older and maybe—" He looked at her hopefully. "Maybe there will be more children." Penelope felt her cheeks warm. "I would like more children," she admitted. "I don't want Robert to grow up alone like I did." "Then we'll build on," Ryder declared. "I'll start as soon as the ground is fully thawed." True to his word, Ryder spent that spring and summer constructing an addition to the cabin. He was meticulous in his work, wanting everything to be perfect. By the time the leaves began to turn in September, they had 2 new bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The cabin was no longer a bachelor's rough shelter but a proper home for a growing family. Penelope discovered she was pregnant again in October, when Robert was almost a year old. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Ryder was just as protective as before, but Penelope was firmer about maintaining her normal activities. She wouldn't be treated like an invalid for 9 months. Their second child, a daughter they named Patricia, arrived on a beautiful June morning in 1880 with far less drama than Robert's birth. The labor was shorter, the delivery smoother. Patricia had Penelope's green eyes and delicate features, though even as an infant she showed signs of having her father's strong will. She was a calmer baby than Robert had been, content to observe the world with solemn attention. Life with 2 young children kept Penelope busy from dawn to dusk. Robert was walking now, getting into everything, requiring constant supervision. Patricia nursed frequently and wanted to be held most of the time. Ryder helped enormously, playing with Robert while Penelope fed Patricia, taking both children for walks so Penelope could have a few moments of peace. They were exhausted and happy, their cabin filled with the noise of family life. On their 3rd wedding anniversary, Ryder surprised Penelope with a gift. He had spent months crafting a beautiful wooden music box, intricately carved with scenes of their valley. When wound, it played a simple melody that made Penelope's eyes fill with tears. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "How did you learn to make something like this?" "Had a lot of time on my hands before you came along," Ryder said, looking pleased by her reaction. "Used to carve to keep from going mad during the long winters. This piece, though, I wanted it to be special, to remind you how much you mean to me." Penelope set the music box carefully aside and wrapped her arms around her husband's neck. "I don't need reminders," she said softly. "You show me every day how much you love me." "I do love you," Ryder said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I knew it was possible to love another person." "You saved me, Penelope, brought me back to life." "You saved me too," Penelope said, kissing him gently. "We saved each other." As the children grew, the valley became their entire world. Robert learned to walk the forest paths with his father, identifying animal tracks and edible plants. Patricia followed her brother everywhere, determined not to be left behind despite her shorter legs. Penelope taught both children to read and write, using Ryder's extensive book collection as their schoolroom. In the evenings, the family would gather around the fireplace, Ryder reading aloud while Penelope sewed, and the children played quietly. Silver Reef slowly became less important to their lives. They made the trip to town only twice a year now, spring and fall, to sell furs and buy supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Each time they visited, Penelope was struck by how much she had changed from the silent, scared woman who had once stitched wedding dresses in Mrs. Henderson's shop. She was still quiet by nature, but it was a comfortable quiet now, not the silence of grief and fear. In 1882, when Robert was almost 4 and Patricia nearly 2, Penelope found herself pregnant once more. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2. She was often ill, unable to keep food down, exhausted beyond measure. Ryder worried constantly, though he tried to hide his concern from her. When Mrs. Turner arrived for the birth in early spring of 1883, she took one look at Penelope and ordered strict bed rest for the final month. The labor was long and frightening. The baby was positioned wrong, causing excruciating pain. Mrs. Turner worked through the night to turn the infant, her capable hands probably saving both mother and child. When the baby finally arrived as dawn broke, Penelope was too exhausted to do more than confirm it was another son before falling into unconsciousness. She woke hours later to find Ryder sitting beside the bed, holding a tiny bundle. His face was haggard, streaked with tears, but he managed a smile when he saw her eyes open. "You scared me," he said hoarsely. "Mrs. Turner said you lost a lot of blood, I thought." His voice broke. "I'm all right," Penelope whispered, though she felt weak as a kitten. "The baby, he's perfect. Small but healthy." Ryder carefully placed the infant in her arms. The baby was indeed smaller than her other 2 had been, but his grip was strong and his cry was vigorous. "I was thinking we could name him after your father's father. What was his name?" "Paul," Penelope said, looking down at her 3rd child. "Paul Reed Zimmerman." Recovery from Paul's birth took months. Penelope remained weak and tired, unable to resume her normal activities. Ryder took over all the household duties, caring for all 3 children, cooking, cleaning, everything. Robert and Patricia, young as they were, tried to help by being quiet and well-behaved. Mrs. Turner stayed for 2 months, finally leaving only when she was convinced Penelope was truly on the mend. By Paul's first birthday, Penelope had regained her strength, though she knew she couldn't risk another pregnancy. The doctor Mrs. Turner had brought in during the difficult birth had been explicit about the dangers. Penelope's body had been pushed to its limits. Another child could kill her. Ryder, who had been terrified by how close he had come to losing her, readily agreed that 3 children were enough. The years rolled on in a pattern of seasons and small joys. Robert grew tall and strong like his father, already showing signs of the man he would become. Patricia was whip-smart and curious about everything, constantly asking questions and demanding explanations. Paul was the quiet one, content to observe and think, reminding Penelope strongly of herself. The 3 children were close despite their different personalities, playing together in the meadow, exploring the forest under Ryder's watchful eye, helping with chores around the homestead. Penelope found deep satisfaction in her life as a mother and wife. She still sewed, but now for pleasure rather than necessity, creating beautiful clothes for her children and decorative items for their home. She kept a garden that was the envy of anyone who saw it, producing abundant vegetables and herbs. She made cheese and butter, preserved fruits and vegetables, spun wool from the sheep Ryder had acquired into yarn for knitting. Her hands were never idle, but the work was fulfilling rather than draining. Ryder thrived as a father. He was patient and kind but firm when necessary, teaching his children about the world with the same careful attention he gave everything. He built them a tree house in the largest pine near the cabin, constructed a swing that hung from a sturdy branch over the creek, carved each of them their own set of toys. On winter evenings, he told them stories about his childhood in Ohio, his time in the war edited carefully to remove the worst horrors, his early days in the mountains learning to survive. They made the trip to Silver Reef less and less frequently as the years passed. The town was growing, becoming more civilized, which somehow made it feel less welcoming to Penelope. She preferred the wild peace of her valley. When they did visit, she was always struck by the noise and crowds, grateful when they could return to their quiet home. In the summer of 1889, when Robert was 10, Patricia 8, and Paul 6, a stranger rode into their valley. Ryder was immediately on guard, his rifle in hand as he stepped out to meet the visitor. The man raised his hands peacefully, identifying himself as a surveyor working for the government. He had stumbled upon their valley by accident and was impressed by the homestead Ryder had built. Over coffee, the surveyor explained that the government was encouraging settlement in the area, offering land grants to families willing to work the ground. Ryder listened politely, but made it clear he had no interest in paperwork or official claims. He had built his life here through his own sweat and effort, and no government had the right to tell him what he could or couldn't do with it. The surveyor left the next morning, but his visit left Ryder unsettled. That night, as he and Penelope lay in bed, he voiced his concerns. What if the government decides they want this land? What if they try to force us out? Then we'll fight, Penelope said firmly. This is our home. We've built a life here. I won't let anyone take that from us. Ryder pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. When did my quiet little seamstress become such a fierce defender of her territory? When I found something worth defending, Penelope said, snuggling into his warmth. You gave me a home, Ryder. A real home. I'll protect it with everything I have. Fortunately, their fears proved unfounded. No one else came to challenge their claim to the valley. Life continued its peaceful rhythm, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Robert began learning to hunt with his father, showing a natural talent for tracking and marksmanship. Patricia declared she wanted to be a teacher and threw herself into learning everything she could from Ryder's books. Paul spent hours carving wood like his father, his small hands surprisingly skillful. Penelope watched her children grow with a mixture of pride and wistfulness. They were becoming their own people, separate from her, and while she was proud of their independence, she missed the days when they were small and needed her for everything. Ryder, observing her melancholy one autumn evening, pulled her into his arms. They're growing up, he said gently. That's what we want, isn't it? For them to become strong, capable adults. Of course, Penelope said, wiping her eyes. I'm being foolish. It's just, it all goes so fast. Robert will be a man before we know it. And he'll have a good foundation because of you, Ryder said. Because of us. We've given them a childhood full of love and security. That's more than most children get. Penelope nodded, knowing he was right. She had given her children what she had lost too young. A stable home with parents who loved them unconditionally. That was no small thing. The children continued to flourish. Robert shot up in height, surpassing his father by his 14th birthday. Patricia's sharp mind devoured every book in the house, and she began writing her own stories in careful script. Paul remained quiet but showed a deep sensitivity to the natural world, often disappearing for hours to observe animals or sketch plants. In 1895, when Penelope was 39 years old and had been married to Ryder for 17 years, Robert announced he wanted to go to school in Salt Lake City. He was 18 now, a man grown, and he wanted to study engineering. Penelope's first instinct was to refuse, to keep her son safe in their valley. But Ryder, wise as always, pointed out that they had raised their children to be independent thinkers. They couldn't hold them back now. Robert left that fall, and Penelope cried for days. The cabin felt empty without his booming laugh and endless energy. But he wrote regularly, filling his letters with descriptions of his studies and city life. He came home for visits when he could, and each time Penelope was struck by how much more mature he seemed. Patricia, at 16, announced she wanted to be a teacher and planned to attend normal school when she turned 18. Paul, at 14, remained uncertain about his future, but was in no hurry to leave the valley. Penelope was grateful for the reprieve. She wasn't ready to have all her children gone. As Penelope entered her 40s, she found herself reflecting on the unexpected path her life had taken. She had gone from a silent, grieving girl in a seamstress shop to a wife and mother, confident and content in her life. Ryder had given her that. His acceptance of her quiet nature, his understanding of her need for peace, had allowed her to heal and grow in ways she never could have in town. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, something they still did whenever weather permitted, Penelope voiced this thought. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ryder looked at her quizzically. "For what?" "For loving me as I am. For never trying to change me or make me into someone I'm not." Ryder took her hand, his callous thumb stroking her knuckles. "You brought peace to my heart, Penelope. After the war, I was full of rage and grief and guilt. I came out here to escape, but I was still trapped inside my own head. Then I met you, and for the first time in years I felt calm. Your quiet wasn't a deficit. It was a balm. It healed something broken in me." "We healed each other," Penelope said, echoing words she had spoken years ago. "We did," Ryder agreed, "and we built something beautiful together. Look at our children. Look at this life we've created. We did that, Penelope. You and me." The years continued their march. Robert graduated from his engineering program and took a job with a mining company, though he visited the valley whenever he could. Patricia went off to normal school at 18 and returned 2 years later with a teaching certificate and a husband, a quiet young man named Thomas, who reminded Penelope strongly of herself. They settled in a small town about 50 miles away, close enough to visit but far enough to build their own life. Paul remained in the valley, taking over more and more of the physical work as Ryder aged. At 20, he announced he had no desire to leave, that he wanted to build his own cabin in the valley and live as his father had. Ryder, aging but still strong at 55, helped his youngest son construct a home on the far side of the meadow. Paul eventually married a young woman from Silver Reef, a shy girl who fit into the valley life as naturally as Penelope had. Penelope and Ryder entered their 60s with grace, their bodies slower but their minds sharp. They had grandchildren now, small people who visited the valley and shrieked with delight at the freedom it offered. Penelope made them clothes and toys, told them stories, taught them to read. Ryder carved them wooden animals and showed them how to fish in the creek. They were doting grandparents, savoring this new chapter of their lives. One spring evening in 1910, when Penelope was 54 and Ryder was 62, they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air was soft and smelled of pine and growing things. From Paul's cabin across the meadow, They could hear the faint sound of a baby crying, their newest grandchild announcing her hunger. "You ever regret it?" Ryder asked suddenly. "Giving up your life in town to come live in the middle of nowhere with a scarred old mountain man?" Penelope turned to look at her husband, this man who had been her partner for over 30 years. His hair was more silver than dark now, his face deeply lined by sun and wind and time. But his blue eyes were the same, still capable of looking into her soul. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." Ryder smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "I love you, Penelope Zimmerman. I loved you the moment I walked into that seamstress shop and saw you sitting there so quiet and self-contained. I loved you when you agreed to take a walk with me. I loved you when you said yes to being my wife. I love you more with every passing day." "I love you too," Penelope said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me everything, Ryder. A home, a family, peace. You saw me when everyone else looked right through me. You valued my quiet when everyone else called it a flaw." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness fell and the stars multiplied overhead. After a while, Ryder stood and offered Penelope his hand. "Come to bed, my love. Tomorrow's another day." Penelope took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. They walked into their cabin together, as they had done thousands of times over the past 3 decades, and closed the door on the world outside. Inside was warmth and light and love, everything they had built together through years of trust and understanding and devotion. As Penelope settled into bed beside her husband, his arm coming around her waist in the familiar gesture of affection, she thought about the woman she had been in Silver Reef so long ago. That silent, sad girl who had believed she would never feel joy again. How wrong she had been. Life had surprised her with this rough, gentle mountain man who loved her quiet soul, who built her a home in a hidden valley, who gave her children and grandchildren and decades of contentment. They said she was too quiet, the townspeople who had judged her all those years ago. But Ryder had understood that her silence wasn't emptiness. It was peace. And in finding each other, they had created a haven where that peace could flourish and grow into something beautiful. Penelope drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. A home filled with love, children who had grown into good people, grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. She had been blessed beyond measure, and she knew it. Every single day, she knew it and was grateful. The years rolled on in their gentle rhythm. Ryder and Penelope aged together, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1918 with all their children and grandchildren gathered in the valley. It was a joyous occasion, the meadow filled with laughter and the sounds of family. Robert, now 40 years old with children of his own, gave a toast to his parents that brought tears to everyone's eyes. He spoke of growing up in the valley, of learning from his father's strength and his mother's quiet wisdom, of the example they had set for building a marriage based on mutual respect and deep affection. Patricia, 36 and the mother of 5, spoke about her mother's gentle guidance and how it had shaped her own approach to teaching and parenting. Paul, 34 with 3 children, talked about the peace of the valley and how his parents had created a sanctuary not just from the outside world but within their own hearts. As Penelope listened to her children speak, she felt overwhelmed by gratitude. She had done something right. Despite her fears and insecurities, despite the trauma of her early losses, she had managed to raise children who were happy and healthy and whole. She caught Ryder's eye across the crowd and saw her own emotions reflected in his face. They had done this together, built this beautiful legacy. The celebration lasted long into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. As the sun set and the stars emerged, Penelope found herself alone for a moment on her porch, watching her family enjoy themselves. Ryder appeared beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "Quite a party," he said, his voice gravelly with age but still strong. "Quite a life," Penelope responded, leaning into his solid warmth. "Indeed." Ryder was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been thinking about what Robert said in his toast, about us setting an example. Do you think we did?" "I know we did," Penelope said firmly. "Look at them, Ryder. Look at our children. They're all in solid marriages, raising their own children with love and care. They learned that from watching us." "We learned as we went," Ryder mused, "made plenty of mistakes along the way." "But we made them together," Penelope said. "And we always came back to each other. That's what matters." The party continued around them, but for that moment it was just the two of them, as it had been in the beginning. Ryder turned Penelope to face him and took both her hands in his. "Thank you," he said softly, "for saying yes all those years ago, for taking a chance on a broken-down mountain man, for building this life with me." "Thank you for seeing me," Penelope responded, "for loving my quiet heart, for giving me a home where I could finally be myself." They kissed then, a gentle press of lips that held decades of love and devotion. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling, their eyes bright with happy tears. The years after their 40th anniversary were peaceful and content. Ryder's body began to slow more noticeably, his joints stiff from decades of hard physical labor. Penelope developed some arthritis in her hands, making sewing more difficult, but she adapted, working in shorter bursts with more rest periods. They relied more on Paul for the heavy work around the homestead, but they remained active and engaged with life. They spent their days in comfortable routine. Breakfast together as the sun rose, Ryder checking his trap lines or working on small projects while Penelope tended her garden or sewed. Afternoons were for reading or receiving visits from grandchildren. Evenings were for sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over their valley, talking about everything and nothing. In the spring of 1922, Ryder took ill with a fever that wouldn't break. Paul rode to fetch the doctor, but by the time they returned, Ryder was delirious, his strong body finally succumbing to age and illness. Penelope sat beside his bed for 3 days, holding his hand, whispering words of love and comfort. On the third night, with Penelope curled beside him in bed, Ryder drew his last breath. He went peacefully, his face relaxed, his hand clasped in hers. Penelope's grief was profound but quiet, as everything about her was quiet. She didn't wail or rage. She simply felt the loss settle into her bones, a weight that would never fully lift. They buried Ryder on a hill overlooking the valley, under a large pine tree he had always loved. The entire family gathered for the funeral, and even the weather seemed to mourn, rain falling gently as they laid him to rest. In the weeks after Ryder's death, Penelope moved through her days mechanically. She cooked and cleaned and tended her garden, but the joy had gone out of everything. The cabin felt empty without Ryder's presence, without his voice and laughter and warmth. She couldn't sleep in their bed, couldn't bear to reach across in the night and find emptiness where he should be. Paul and his wife offered to have her come live with them, but Penelope refused. This was her home. Ryder had built it for her, and she wasn't leaving. Gradually, painfully, she found a new rhythm to her days. She took walks through the forest, speaking aloud to Ryder as though he could hear her. She worked in her garden, finding solace in the growing things. She sewed clothes for her great-grandchildren, finding purpose in creating something useful and beautiful. Her children visited frequently, worried about her living alone. But Penelope assured them she was all right. She was sad, yes. She missed Ryder with an ache that would never fully heal. But she had 44 years of beautiful memories to sustain her. She had loved deeply and been deeply loved in return. Not everyone could say that. As the seasons passed, Penelope found peace in her solitude. She was 70 years old now, her hair completely white, her body frail but her mind still sharp. She spent her days in quiet contemplation, remembering her life with Ryder, grateful for every moment they had shared. She knew her own time was limited, and she was not afraid. When her moment came, she would be ready to join her husband. One crisp autumn morning in 1924, Penelope didn't wake up. She passed peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face, her hands folded over her heart. Paul found her when he came to check on her, and though he grieved, he also felt a sense of rightness. She and Ryder had been apart for too long. Now they were together again. They buried Penelope beside Ryder on the hill overlooking the valley. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to say goodbye, to celebrate a life well lived and a love that had endured. Patricia spoke at the funeral, her voice steady despite her tears. "My mother was the quietest person I've ever known," she said. The world tried to make her feel like that was a flaw, something to be ashamed of. But my father understood that her quiet was a gift. It brought peace to his troubled heart and created a home filled with love and serenity. Together, they built something beautiful in this valley. They raised us with wisdom and patience. They showed us what true partnership looks like. They loved each other completely, from the day they met until the day they died. That is their legacy, and it lives on in all of us. As they lowered Penelope into the ground beside her husband, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the valley in golden light. It felt like a benediction, a final blessing on two lives joined in love and devotion. The valley remained in the family, passed down through the generations. Paul's children and grandchildren continued to live there, maintaining the homestead Ryder had built, tending the land Penelope had loved. The cabin was preserved as it had been, a testament to the love story that had unfolded within its walls. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the mountains and the world grew still, those who lived in the valley swore they could feel a presence. Two souls walking hand in hand through the meadow, finally at peace, finally home. The quiet seamstress and her mountain man, together for eternity in the place they had made their own. Their story became legend in the family, passed down to each new generation. Children grew up hearing about great-great-grandmother Penelope, who was too quiet for the town but perfect for the mountains, and great-great-grandfather Ryder, who loved the peace she brought to his heart. They heard about a love that defied expectations, that created a sanctuary in a hidden valley, that produced a family tree with branches spreading across the west. It was a story about finding where you belong, about being loved for exactly who you are, about building a life based on understanding and respect and deep affection. It was a reminder that quiet hearts can love just as fiercely as loud ones, that peace is its own kind of strength, that sometimes the best thing you can give another person is simply acceptance of their true self. The seamstress and the mountain man had found each other against all odds in a little town in Utah in 1878, and from that meeting had sprung a love that would echo through generations, a testament to the transformative power of being truly seen and valued by another human being. They had lived, they had loved, they had built something that would outlast them both. And in the end, what more could anyone ask from a life well lived?